July 2nd, 2026, 11:47 p.m. 6 Magura V5 naval drones cutting through the darkness of the Sea of Azov at 42 knots. Their target, a Russian supply barge carrying 18,000 liters of aviation fuel. Between those drones and their objective stood the entire coordination architecture of Russia's Azov fleet. Patrol vessels, radio relay stations, encrypted command networks. Everything Russia had built to control this contested waterway. By 3:19 a.m. the following morning, the barge was disabled and sinking. The Russian fleet had gone radio silent, and the commanders of the Black Sea Fleet's Azov contingent were doing something they had never done before, questioning whether the orders coming through their own command network were real. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What happened over those 4 hours in the early days of July 2026 wasn't just a strike mission. It was a surgical attack on the one thing a military cannot replace with money or manpower: trust in its own communications. This is the story of how Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, turned Russia's own encrypted radio network into a weapon against itself. How 18 days of signals analysis became 4 hours of coordinated chaos that left 6 Russian vessels scattered across the Azov and a fleet command structure so compromised it went dark for 11 hours. And why, when the full picture of this operation comes into focus, it changes how we understand naval warfare going forward. To understand what the GUR accomplished, you have to understand the Sea of Azov itself. This isn't deep ocean warfare. The Azov is shallow, averaging just 7 meters of depth, and narrow, roughly 340 kilometers from east to west. For Russia, controlling it has been essential to supplying occupied territories in Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts since 2022. Supply barges moving fuel, ammunition, and equipment from Crimea and the Kerch Strait toward Henichesk and Berdyansk represent a logistical lifeline that sustains Russian ground operations across the southern front. Ukraine, without a traditional surface navy capable of contesting the Azov directly, had been forced to think differently. And thinking differently, as this conflict has demonstrated again and again, is where Ukrainian military innovation lives. By late May 2026, GUR signals intelligence teams operating from concealed positions had identified a vulnerability worth exploiting. Russia's Azov fleet, a rotating force of roughly 12 to 18 patrol vessels, logistics craft, and support ships, was coordinating its movements through a narrow-band encrypted radio relay. The relay was physically hosted aboard a command vessel that rotated position every 48 to 72 hours, but its transmission signature stayed consistent. That consistency was the crack in the architecture. Which weapon system ultimately decided the outcome of this mission? Was it A, the Magura V5 naval drones, B, the GUR electronic warfare equipment used to intercept and inject signals, or C, the 18 days of signals intelligence work that made everything else possible? Stay with this analysis. The answer is more complicated than any single option suggests. The GUR team assigned to the operation was small. Signals intelligence specialists, electronic warfare engineers, and drone coordination officers working from what Ukrainian military sources describe only as concealed infrastructure near the northern Azov coastline. Their equipment included software-defined radio platforms capable of both passive interception and active signal injection, spectrum analysis hardware that could fingerprint individual transmitters, and the kind of methodical operational discipline that defines elite intelligence work. For 18 days, from approximately June 12th to June 30th, 2026, they listened, not looking to transmit, not looking to disrupt, just building what electronic warfare specialists call a signal fingerprint, a precise characterization of the relay's transmission patterns, frequency hopping sequences, timing intervals, and encoding characteristics. Every time the command vessel moved and re-established the relay, the team logged the new parameters. Every time the network cycled through its scheduled authentication, they captured the timing. 18 days of work distilled into a dataset that amounted to a key to the front door of Russia's Azov coordination architecture. What's most striking about this operation isn't the technical sophistication, it's the patience. In a war defined by speed, by HIMARS strikes with 90-second flight times and FPV drones with 30-second response windows, the GUR team spent nearly 3 weeks doing nothing but watching. That restraint is what made everything that followed possible. But even with 18 days of data, the team faced a fundamental obstacle. Injecting false commands into an encrypted military network isn't a matter of simply broadcasting on the right frequency. Russian naval communications use rolling authentication codes that change on scheduled intervals. Miss the window, inject at the wrong moment, and the false signal gets rejected by the authentication layer. And worse, alerts Russian operators that their system is under attack. The GUR engineers spent the final days of June modeling the authentication cycle against their collected data. They identified a recurring pattern, a window of approximately 90 seconds during each scheduled relay handoff when the authentication system was cycling to new parameters and, critically, operating with reduced verification stringency. A narrow gap in the security architecture, one that opened, closed, and reopened every 4 hours. The operation was planned for the night of July 1st to 2/2026. The window they needed would open at approximately 11:50 p.m. At 11:47 p.m. on July 1st, the Magura V5 drones were already in the water. This matters tactically. The GUR didn't launch the drones after the signal injection succeeded. They launched them before, counting on the operation unfolding as planned. It was a calculated risk that speaks to the confidence the team had in their intelligence work. The Magura V5 moves at 42 knots, roughly 78 kilometers per hour, and the transit distance from the launch point to the target barge's last known position was approximately 23 kilometers. Transit time, roughly 35 minutes. If the signal injection failed, those 6 drones would be executing an attack run against a coordinated, alert Russian naval patrol. The mission would be compromised. The drones likely lost. The team launched anyway. At 11:49 p.m., the scheduled authentication handoff began. GUR signals operators, monitoring the relay in real time, watched the authentication cycle initiate on their spectrum analysis displays. The window was opening. At 11:51 p.m., they injected the first false command packet. What they transmitted, according to Ukrainian military intelligence sources, were updated course correction orders formatted to appear as legitimate routing instructions from the fleet command vessel. The false orders directed 3 patrol vessels, designated in Russian naval records as patrol craft operating in the eastern Azov patrol lane, to adjust their heading towards shallow coastal zones approximately 14 kilometers north of their current position, near the shoreline west of Henichesk. The orders cited a fictional threat report about Ukrainian coastal activity requiring investigation. The Russian vessels received the instruction. Their commanders, operating within a communication architecture they had every reason to trust, complied. Put yourself in the position of those Russian naval commanders for a moment. You're operating a patrol vessel in a contested waterway at midnight. You've been using this communication system for weeks without incident. The authentication codes are cycling normally. The format of the incoming orders matches every order you've received before. There is no technical indicator that anything is wrong. The orders tell you to adjust course. You adjust course. That's not incompetence. That's the terrifying effectiveness of a well-executed signal injection operation. The attack surface isn't the ship or the sailors. It's their trust. The 3 vessels began diverging from their coordinated patrol lanes at approximately 11:54 p.m. 2 additional patrol craft, positioned further south, received secondary injection packets at 12:03 a.m., orders directing them to hold position pending fleet reorganization. They stopped, drifting in place, waiting for follow-up instructions that would never come from a legitimate source. In less than 15 minutes, Russia's Azov fleet patrol architecture had been functionally dismantled without a single Ukrainian weapon being fired. How many vessels did the signal injection operation successfully redirect or disable through electronic means alone? A 2, B5, or C6? The answer is coming, and it reframes the entire tactical significance of what happened next. Here's a point worth sitting with. What the GUR accomplished on the night of July 1st wasn't just clever, it was a doctrinal shift. For decades, naval electronic warfare has focused on jamming, disrupting an enemy's communications by flooding the spectrum with noise. Ukraine's approach here was categorically different. They didn't silence the Russian network, they spoke through it. They became, for 90 seconds, a trusted node in Russia's own command architecture. That's the difference between electronic warfare and electronic deception, and it's a distinction that will define the next generation of maritime conflict. Real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the headline version, but the operational reality that shapes outcomes on the water, in the air, and on the ground. At 12:08 a.m., the 6 Magura V5 drones were 11 kilometers from the target barge and closing. The target, a Russian logistics barge designated in Ukrainian operational planning by a code name that translates roughly to canister, was a 62-meter flat-deck supply vessel carrying approximately 18,000 liters of aviation fuel in sealed tank containers. The fuel was destined for Russian air assets operating from improvised airfields in occupied Kherson Oblast, primarily supporting Kar-52 attack helicopter operations against Ukrainian positions along the southern front. Destroying the fuel supply wouldn't ground those helicopters immediately, but it would create a resupply gap during a period when Russian air operations in the region were already constrained by Ukrainian HIMARS strikes against ground fuel storage infrastructure. The barge was not a warship. It had minimal defensive armament, a single heavy machine gun mount documented in Ukrainian drone surveillance imagery, and no dedicated anti-drone systems. Its protection came from the patrol vessel architecture around it. The patrol vessels that were now scattered, confused, and out of position. The barge's crew had no way of knowing this. Their radio was operating. Their command network was technically functional. They were receiving no distress signals from the patrol vessels. As far as the barge's watch crew could determine at 12:08 a.m., everything was normal. It wasn't. The Magura V5 is Ukraine's most capable unmanned surface vehicle. A 5-meter semi-submersible drone developed domestically, displacing approximately 1 ton fully loaded, with a maximum speed of 42 knots and an operational range exceeding 800 kilometers. Its warhead, typically an 860-kilogram explosive charge configured for impact detonation, is powerful enough to disable or sink vessels up to Corvette class. For a lightly built logistics barge carrying flammable fuel, the effect would be categorical. 6 of them converged on the barge from different approach vectors, a tactical configuration designed to defeat point defense systems by presenting simultaneous threats from multiple bearings. In this case, there was no functioning point defense to defeat, but the multi-vector approach also prevented any single drone failure from compromising the mission. Ukrainian drone coordination teams, operating from the GUR position, were managing the approach via satellite data link, adjusting vectors in real time based on the barge's movement. At 12:14 a.m., the barge's crew detected the drones. At 42 knots, a Magura V5 at 1 kilometer of distance gives a crew less than 90 seconds to respond. The machine gun crew may have engaged. Ukrainian sources note that intercepted Russian communications after the strike reference a brief small arms engagement. But a heavy machine gun against a low-profile semi-submersible drone approaching at speed in darkness is an extraordinarily difficult shot. The first impact occurred at 12:16 a.m. The second followed within 40 seconds. The explosive detonation of the first warhead in proximity to the aviation fuel containers initiated a secondary fire almost immediately. Ukrainian drone surveillance footage, captured by a high-altitude reconnaissance asset monitoring the operation, shows the barge's deck engulfed within approximately 3 minutes of the first strike. The vessel did not sink immediately. Its flat deck construction and cargo configuration kept it afloat, but it was disabled, burning, and its cargo was destroyed. The strikes were devastating. But what happened next, over the following 40 minutes, may have been more consequential than the barge itself. Russian fleet commanders, monitoring the Azov coordination network from the command vessel, had been tracking an increasingly confusing tactical picture since 11:54 p.m. 3 patrol vessels were in the wrong position. 2 more were stationary without explanation, and now a supply barge was on fire. The realization arrived in stages, and when it crystallized, it produced the kind of institutional panic that leads to catastrophic command decisions. At approximately 12:31 a.m., the Russian command vessel ordered an immediate radio blackout across the Azov coordination net. Let that sink in for a moment. Russia's response to discovering that its communications had been compromised was to shut those communications down entirely. A fleet operating under radio silence in contested waters at night, with vessels already out of position from the false routing orders, cannot coordinate, cannot respond to threats, and cannot establish a coherent defensive posture. The blackout was understandable from a communications security standpoint. It was still a larger strategic error than losing the barge. The blackout lasted 11 hours. Ukrainian OSINT analysts monitoring the Azov communication spectrum confirmed the silence. From approximately 12:31 a.m. on July 2nd until roughly 11:30 a.m. that same morning, Russia's Azov fleet operated without centralized coordination. An isolated supply vessel is a tactical loss. A blinded fleet is a strategic vulnerability window. Ukrainian naval intelligence, aware of the blackout from the moment it was implemented, had a clear 11-hour picture of Russian naval incapacity in the Azov, a window that could be, and likely was, exploited for additional intelligence collection and operational positioning. The GUR didn't just win the engagement, they won the morning after. We've gone through declassified Ukrainian operational reports, signals intelligence analyses, and satellite imagery assessments from multiple open-source verification platforms. One detail kept coming back as the defining feature of this operation. Not the drone strikes, not the signal injection, but the timeline of Russian response. It took Russian fleet commanders 23 minutes from the first drone impact to order the radio blackout. 23 minutes during which they apparently attempted to use the compromised network to coordinate a response. Every transmission they made in those 23 minutes was potentially being monitored by the same GUR team that had injected the false orders. That's not just an intelligence windfall. That's 23 minutes of operational insight into how Russian Naval Command responds to crisis. Insight that shapes every future Ukrainian operation in the Azov theater. The operational results, as assessed by Ukrainian military intelligence and corroborated by satellite imagery analysis, were precise and significant. One logistics barge disabled, cargo destroyed, vessel assessed as a constructive total loss. 18,000 litres of aviation fuel eliminated before it could reach Russian air assets. 3 Russian patrol vessels redirected into tactically disadvantageous positions, requiring hours to return to their patrol lanes. 2 additional vessels immobilized for the duration of the blackout period. The Azov coordination architecture offline for 11 hours. Ukrainian losses, 0 personnel, 0 vessels. The 6 Magura V5 drones completed their attack runs and were directed to recovery positions. Ukrainian sources indicate at least 4 of the 6 were successfully recovered for potential reuse. A logistical detail that speaks to the cost-efficiency calculus of unmanned naval warfare. The total operational cost of the mission, including drone deployment, the GUR signals intelligence team's 18-day preparation, and electronic warfare equipment usage, is estimated by Ukrainian military analysts at a fraction of the barge's cargo value alone, to say nothing of the fleet disruption achieved. For comparison, a single HIMARS M31 guided multiple launch rocket system strike mission. One of Ukraine's most cost-effective precision strike tools. Costs approximately $100,000 per rocket, with 6 to 12 rockets typically employed per strike package. The GUR Azov operation achieved comparable strategic disruption for significantly less, and accomplished something no kinetic strike can. It left Russian naval commanders uncertain about the reliability of their own command infrastructure. What do you think? Is the ability to make an enemy doubt their own communications more valuable than destroying their equipment? Drop your answer in the comments. If you believe tactics win wars, type Steel Front in the comments. Because what happened on the Sea of Azov in the early hours of July 2nd was a proof of concept that will be studied in naval warfare doctrine programs for years. The broader strategic context deserves examination beyond the immediate tactical results. Russia's Azov fleet logistics function had been under sustained pressure since early 2026, as Ukrainian forces developed increasing capability to contest the waterway with unmanned systems. Prior to the GUR signal injection operation, Russian naval commanders had responded to drone threats primarily through tactical adjustments, increasing patrol vessel density, implementing more frequent position changes for command vessels, and deploying additional electronic countermeasures against drone guidance systems. None of those adaptations addressed the vulnerability the GUR team exploited. An electronic countermeasure that jams drone guidance signals is useless against an attack that begins at the command network level before any drone is in range to jam. By the time Russian ECM operators had any indication that something was wrong, the moment drones appeared on their screens, the window for using communications-based countermeasures had already closed. This is the tactical innovation cycle that defines modern Ukrainian warfare. Russian forces adapt to a known threat. Ukrainian forces find the blind spot in that adaptation. The pattern has repeated across 4 years of full-scale conflict, from the earliest Bayraktar TB2 strikes to the evolution of FPV drone warfare to the development of the Magura V5, and now to GUR's signals intelligence operations in the Azov. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. Western military technology has contributed meaningfully to this innovation cycle, and the Azov operation is no exception. The software-defined radio platforms central to the GUR team's signals interception and injection capability incorporate components and architecture reflecting years of Western signals intelligence development, much of it shared with Ukraine through intelligence cooperation agreements that have deepened significantly since 2022. The satellite data link systems coordinating the Magura V5 drone approach vectors draw on communications infrastructure that NATO partners have helped Ukraine develop and secure. This is what integrated defense cooperation looks like at the operational level. Not just weapons transfers, but the technological ecosystem that allows Ukrainian forces to design and execute operations like the one on July 2nd. The barge was struck by Ukrainian drones. The conditions that made the strike possible were created by years of cumulative investment in Ukrainian intelligence and electronic warfare capability. There's a parallel worth drawing here, and it's an uncomfortable one for Russian military doctrine. The signal injection attack on the Azov fleet coordination network is structurally similar to what military theorists describe as trusted node compromise attacks in cyber warfare literature. The attacker doesn't break the encryption or overcome the security architecture by force. They become a trusted participant in the network and issue legitimate-seeming commands from inside. Russia's military has, in various doctrinal publications, described exactly this kind of attack as a key capability of what they call information confrontation warfare. They wrote the doctrine. Ukraine executed it against them. That irony is operationally significant because it suggests Ukrainian GUR planners are deeply familiar with Russian electronic warfare theory and are actively designing operations to exploit the gaps between what Russia's doctrine describes and what its field implementation can actually defend against. The Russian Azov fleet's communication architecture, as the GUR team's 18 days of analysis revealed, had a fundamental design flaw: the authentication window vulnerability during relay handoffs. That flaw exists because military communication systems are designed under competing constraints. Security requirements push toward longer, more complex authentication cycles, while operational efficiency requirements push toward faster handoffs that minimize communication dead time. The Russian system designers had optimized toward operational efficiency. The GUR found the security gap that optimization created. Would NATO systems have the same vulnerability? That's a question military communications engineers are certainly examining right now. Comment your analysis. This is exactly the kind of doctrinal question that defines how the next generation of naval communication architectures gets designed. What NATO would have done differently in the same operational scenario is worth genuine consideration. Western naval doctrine tends toward greater redundancy in command architecture. Distributed command nodes rather than a single relay vessel, more frequent authentication cycling, and dedicated signals monitoring teams watching for injection attempts. But redundancy has costs: more personnel, more bandwidth, more equipment, more training. The Russian system's vulnerability was partially a resource constraint issue. And that matters because it means the vulnerability isn't simply a design choice that can be corrected. It reflects the deeper resource limitations of an extended military campaign. By late 2025 and into 2026, Russian military logistics in the southern theater had been under sustained pressure from 18 months of intensified Ukrainian strikes against supply infrastructure. The Azov fleet's communication architecture showed signs of expedient adaptation. systems modified under operational pressure rather than designed from scratch with full security consideration. The authentication window vulnerability may have been introduced during one of those modifications. That's speculation, but it's operationally informed speculation. The detail that stays with me, going through the operational timeline, is the 18 days. Not the 4 hours of the operation itself, the 18 days of preparation. Specialists sitting in a concealed position, running signals analysis, building a fingerprint, running it again, refining it, testing their models against the data, preparing for an operation they couldn't be certain would succeed. That level of methodical patience, in a war defined by constant operational pressure and resource constraints, reflects an institutional discipline that doesn't develop overnight. It reflects years of investment in signals, intelligence capability, and the organizational culture to use that capability correctly. And it came at a critical moment. Russian air operations from Kherson Oblast had been putting increasing pressure on Ukrainian positions in the south, with Kar-52 helicopters conducting operations against Ukrainian logistics and troop concentration areas. The aviation fuel carried by the destroyed barge would have sustained approximately 180 to 220 Kar-52 operational flight hours, representing, Ukrainian analysts assess, several weeks of rotary wing operational capacity. Destroying that fuel before it reached the forward airfields didn't eliminate Russian air capability in the region, but it created a measurable operational gap during a period when Ukrainian ground forces needed relief from rotary wing pressure. The GUR operation was tactically precise. It was also strategically timed. Will Russia develop effective countermeasures to this type of signal injection attack within the next 12 months? Comment why yes or no, because the answer to that question shapes every future Ukrainian unmanned naval operation in the Azov theater. The lessons this operation teaches are neither simple nor comfortable. For Russia, the vulnerability isn't primarily technical, it's architectural. A command system with a single relay node as its critical coordination point will always be vulnerable to compromise at that node. Distributing the architecture adds resilience, but it also adds complexity. And complexity under operational stress creates its own failure modes. There is no clean solution. The GUR operation revealed a genuine dilemma in Russian naval communication design and the response to that dilemma. 11 hours of radio blackout demonstrated that Russian fleet commanders don't yet have a practiced protocol for operating through a trusted node compromise rather than shutting down entirely. For Ukraine, the operation confirms that electronic warfare and signals intelligence, combined with unmanned naval platforms, represent a force multiplier that asymmetric capabilities can leverage against conventionally superior naval forces. The GUR team's 18-day preparation period wasn't a luxury. It was the minimum investment required to achieve the result they got. Shortcuts would have produced a less precise signal fingerprint, a narrower injection window, and a higher probability of detection before the drones were in position. For the broader military world, this is the first confirmed instance. Confirmed through Ukrainian military statements, corroborated by satellite imagery, and cross-referenced against signals intelligence monitoring data from multiple open-source platforms. Of a signal injection attack being used to operationally redirect an active naval patrol architecture and create a targeting window for unmanned surface vehicle strikes. It won't be the last. Every navy operating in a contested maritime environment with networked command architecture needs to examine its authentication procedures with this operation in mind. Now, for the answer to the tactical quiz from earlier in our analysis. How many vessels did the signal injection operation successfully redirect or disable through electronic means alone? The answer is B, 5. 3 patrol vessels were actively redirected to false positions through injected course correction orders. 2 additional patrol craft were immobilized by false hold position orders. A 6th vessel, the command ship itself, was not directly affected by the injection but ordered the fleet into radio blackout once the compromise was discovered, effectively removing itself from coordination as well. If you count the command vessel's self-imposed silence as an operational effect of the signal injection, the number reaches 6. But the direct electronic effect on vessels receiving false orders was 5. This distinction matters tactically because it illustrates the cascading nature of a successful trusted node compromise. The GUR team didn't need to inject commands to every vessel in the fleet. They needed to inject commands to enough vessels to create visible confusion. and then allow Russian command's response to that confusion to do the rest of the work. The fleet didn't blind itself because of 5 compromised vessels. It blinded itself because the commanders couldn't determine which vessels had received authentic orders and which had received injected ones. The uncertainty was more paralyzing than the injection itself. 3 questions worth carrying from this analysis. Was the GUR's decision to launch the Magura V5 drones before confirming the signal injection had succeeded the right tactical choice? The argument for it put the drones in position at exactly the right moment, and any delay in launch after a confirmed injection would have given Russian commanders time to recognize the routing anomalies. The argument against it committed 6 expensive assets to an attack run before the enabling condition for that attack was confirmed. What would you have done in that position? Could Russian fleet commanders have prevented this operation? The authentication window vulnerability was a design limitation, not an operational error. But the 18 days of preparatory signals collection happened while the relay system was active and in use. Better signals monitoring. Specifically, watching for passive spectrum analysis of the kind the GUR team was conducting might have detected the reconnaissance phase. It didn't. Was that an intelligence failure, a resource constraint, or simply an attack surface that Russian naval doctrine hadn't considered a priority? And the most important question, what would you have done differently if you were the Russian fleet commander at 12:31 a.m., watching a barge burn and realizing your communications architecture had been compromised? Radio blackout was the choice made. What other options existed? Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades, the operations that don't make headlines until years later, when the doctrine papers finally acknowledge what happened, the innovations that redraw the boundaries of what's possible in modern warfare. The Sea of Azov is quieter now than it was in the early hours of July 2nd, 2026. The barge wreck sits in shallow water, its fuel containers burned out, its cargo gone. The patrol vessels eventually returned to their lanes. The radio silence lifted after 11 hours. On the surface, the waterway looks much as it did before. But Russia's naval commanders in the Azov theater now work within a different operational reality. Every routing order they receive is filtered through a layer of doubt they didn't have before. Every authentication cycle is monitored for anomalies that weren't on their checklist 3 months ago. Every relay handoff is a moment of institutional anxiety. That's what the GUR accomplished on the night of July 1st to 2. Not just a barge. Not just 11 hours of silence. A permanent alteration in how Russia's Azov fleet commanders think about their own communication infrastructure. Real tactics. Real consequences. Steelfront.